Hello guys, I think that I'm good to go now. So please write in the chat whether I'm audible as well as visible. Can anyone mention in the chat whether I'm audible or visible? So let's start our discussion. So what are we going to learn today? So today is the third lecture. Okay. Let's just reduce this to So today is the third lecture on React lifecycle methods. So there has been two lectures that were conducted before this lecture, and I should recommend you all to watch these two lectures also, because in these two lectures I have discussed some really important React lifecycle methods. So in today's discussion, we are going to throw some light on this particular lifecycle method, that is should component update. So we are going to see how this method behaves when it is called and what are the functionalities that it performs. So let's move to the next slide. So in this slide, I'm going to discuss some interesting concepts. Okay. So what am I going to discuss over here? So in this particular slide, as you can see, there are 5 names listed. What are these names? These are nothing but component lifecycle methods that I have discussed in the last two videos. Okay. So I would recommend you all to watch these 5 methods to have a better understanding of how a component lifecycle exists. Okay. So we have discussed about component will mount. We have also discussed about component did mount. We have also discussed about component will unmount, and also we have discussed about get derived state from props as well as get snapshot before update. So let's discuss in brief about all these 5 important lifecycle methods that we have seen in the previous 2 lectures. We have also implemented all of them. So it would be better if you can go through those 2 videos to have an understanding about how each of them work. Along with that, in the last 2 videos, I have also done hands-on implementation on all these 5 uh, lifecycle methods. So the first one, that is component will mount. This is nothing but this particular method is called before the mounting is done. Mounting is done. So this is nothing but one of the 4 important states of a component in a life cycle, in its life cycle. So the first one you have learned was initialization. The second one was mounting. Then the third one was updation. Then unmounting. And these 4 states happen to be in a cycle, like they are dependent on one another. So before this mounting state, this method is called. and this component did mount. This particular method is called after the mounting is done. Along with that, after the first rendering is done. Okay, so after the first rendering, this method is called, but you have to note over here that it is called in between the rendering and the first time the JSX that has been returned to be displayed on browser. So this method, that is component did mount, is called after this mounting, but after the rendering happens, then this method is triggered. But you have to note over here that till then the JSX that has been returned is not displayed on the browser. Now finally, I will discuss about the component will unmount. So let's understand when this method is called. So for component will unmount, we have seen that we can do conditional rendering. That is, we can use a variable inside a ternary operator. So the variable, let it be for now be flag. So flag is nothing but a variable. If it is true, then I render a component. This can be any kind of component. It can also be a custom component. Or if this is false, then I will just simply return null. So whenever this is displayed or this component is mounted, then there is nothing happening. Okay. So there is nothing happening. Okay. But whenever the flag value is false, then the component is no more displayed. So in that case, the component gets unmounted. And whenever something like that happens, this particular method is being called. So we have discussed in brief or in short the working of these three functions. Now let's get back to get derived state from props. This is a very important method, though rarely used. So this is just a function that returns an object, and that object is nothing but an updation of current state value using the props sent by parent component. Okay, so updation of the current state value using the props sent by current component. So within here, let us suppose that we have defined a class component, class component within which I am just returning an object inside the get derived state from props, that is this particular function. So within this function, I have implemented this return statement in which I am returning an object which is just updating the state variable. So let in the constructor, let us suppose that I have defined a state variable. Okay, so the state variable is this dot state equals to, let it be counter. Okay, and this particular state variable gets updated over here using props dot, let us suppose over here I am extracting the data from the props. It can be anything that you have mentioned inside the component. It can be data, value, or any variable that you have mentioned into, or any kind of mathematical operator or any logical operator you can associate with props.data to actually update your counter. So for now, let it be into 10. So whatever the value of prop.data is that I have sent to this particular component, that is this component, so this prop.data got multiplied with 10, and the updated, and that value is set to this counter, which is the state variable associated to this particular component. And this way we can update this particular state variable associated with this component using props. So the name of the function is justified, get derived state. So we can derive the state from props. Okay, so what we are doing over here. Now let's understand the last one, that is get snapshot before update. So about this, what I had to say is get snapshot before update. So whenever we do an updation, we lose the previous state or prop. Okay. So this is a method that always has to return something, either a null or a number or anything, but it has to return something. And whatever it returns, that value gets returned to component did mount, component did update, component did update. That value always gets returned to component did update. Okay, and that particular value can be accessed as a snapshot, which is passed as a parameter to component did update. So in component did update, we have seen that we can capture the prop, we can capture the state, as well as snapshot. So whatever the value I have returned from this particular function, that is get snapshot before update, can be captured in this snapshot parameter, and finally can be logged or can be implemented in some particular operation that you want to do. .log. So within this, you can use that snapshot. You can see the snapshot, and this value which I have returned from within get snapshot before update can be fetched within component did update in the snapshot parameter, and I can return anything. I can use the previous state dot some variable, say counter, into or plus 10, any kind of mathematical operation you can do to get a value, and you can finally return that value to component did update, which will be stored in snapshot and can be logged. So this way we can capture the previous states, because if we don't want to lose them, if we don't want to lose a previous state or a previous prop, then we can capture them in the snapshot just by returning them. So through the get snapshot before update. On returning, this value gets captured in the snapshot and can be used further inside component did update. So now you have got an idea about each of this lifecycle methods in brief. To get a detailed idea, I would recommend you all to go to the lecture 1 and lecture 2 to get a clear understanding. So in today's lecture, that is lecture 3, I will be discussing about a very important lifecycle method. Okay, so let's understand in depth this particular lifecycle method. So let's understand this lifecycle method. So today we are going to implement this particular method, as well as we are going to observe the theoretical understanding with respect to this particular should component update. This is another lifecycle method, okay? So let's go through this text below to have an understanding. So when is this function invoked? So this is invoked before re-rendering. So inside a particular component, if you are rendering something, so before the rendering is done, this should component update is called, okay, or invoked. It receives updated prop, object and state. So this particular function receives two values as parameters. One is the prop and another is the state. We will be also observing about it, like how it receives this particular things, that is the prop and the state, that is updated prop and state as parameters. Return true by default. So this function by default returns true. If we do not mention the function, this will return true. But if we implement this function, then we can write various logics to return various Boolean values, either true or false, which means component will re-render by default. So if it returns true by default, it means that the component will re-render. But if it returns false, then the component won't re-render. We can compare previous prop and state changes with next prop and next state respectively, and return false if we don't want to re-render. So what I have discussed just right. So there might be situations in which there is some similarity in the present prop value and the previous prop value. So if the similarity is quite much, that is the difference is negligible, then it might happen that we don't want to re-render our component. So in that case, we can just return a false to stop the re-rendering. If we return false, then unsafe component will update, or render or component did update will not be invoked. So if we return false, then component will update. So in case of component will update, we use this unsafe before it. This is important. Other than that, there are also functions or methods, that is render and component did update, and these three will also not be invoked if we return false. But if we return true, then all of this will also be invoked. Hence, no re-rendering. The lifecycle method can be skipped when used force update. So using force update, you can skip this should component, because should component update is a question. Should this component update? It's just a question. a function that gives a solution to the question, that is should component update. You can consider this as a question, that is should the component update, and whatever you are returning in this function is an answer to this question. So if you are returning true, then obviously this component should update, and if you are returning false from this function, then the component should not update. But you can like omit the return statement or whatever it is returning just by using force update. So the lifecycle method's value will no more be considered. That is, this method will be skipped using forced update. So now we have got an idea about what is should component update. So let us discuss it one more time. So invoke before re-rendering. Whenever any re-rendering happens, this function is invoked. It receives updated prop and state, returns true by default, which means component will re-render by default. So by default it returns true, that is component will re-render by default. We can compare the previous prop and the state changes with next prop and the next state respectively, and return false if we don't want to re-render. And if we return false, then all these three methods will not be invoked, hence no re-rendering. The lifecycle method can be skipped using forced update. Now let's move to the next slide. So over here, nothing is written. It is just very simple. That is the gist of this function is given over here. That is returns true or false, only Boolean values based on certain conditions. If you want your component to update, then return true. If you do not want, then return false. By default, it returns true. So now you've got an understanding about this particular function. Okay, now let's implement this particular lifecycle method to have a deeper understanding and a better understanding. So we are done with the slides. Okay. Now let's get back to the implementation part. So initially my application is just showing I am app because I have implemented nothing. Now let's get back to VS Code. And let's implement app and sub app. So one thing I need to mention over here, that is app is just a JavaScript file that is inside source, and sub app is another file that is inside components, because sub app is going to be a custom component that I am going to design. So all the components which are custom components, I have kept them within this folder, that is components. Okay. So now let's implement our logic for should component update, isn't it? So now let's implement sub app first. So import React from React. Okay. After that, I'm going to implement the class component, that is sub app. I'm going to extend React / component. Finally, within which I'm going to write some logic. So first, I'm going to use render, and over here I'm going to return a JSX which is a division tag, and finally within the division tag I am going to write I am sub app. Okay. And over here, I'm going to write export default sub app. Okay. In app.js, I have imported sub app. And finally, over here, I'm going to use the sub app component. So you can import sub app from ./components/sub app. Now if I save it and I just move back over here, I can see that I am app and I am sub app is displayed. Now let's slowly move to the implementation of should component update. So I have learned, I have discussed that should component update is called only before re-rendering, and it gives the permission to call the render function or the method. If it returns true, then the render method will be called. If it returns false, then it will not be called. Now, by default, if it is not implemented, it is considered to always return true, which is in this case. So, first, let's assign it some state variables, because it will be easier for us to visualize what is happening using some state variables. So for that, I need a constructor, because I need to define or initialize my state variable within the constructor. And I will be using super to access this keyword. This dot state equals over here child counter, which is a variable, and I am initializing it with 0. Finally, I am going to so I should have implemented this within sub app, not within app, because this is the state variable associated with sub app. Now finally, over here, I am going to use or display the child counter. This dot state dot child counter. And over here, I'm going to enclose this within another div tag. And finally, I'm going to implement a button. On click of which some event might take place. Slash button. And the name will be sub app. Now on click equals, I'm going to define a function, which is an arrow function over here, that is going to just update the state variable child counter. So for that, this dot set state, I'm going to call the set state function to update my state variable. So over here, child counter should be assigned this dot state dot child counter. Now this should be present as an object within the set state function. So I am passing this particular object in which I am setting the child counter to this dot state dot child counter. Now let's implement console.log over here, and I'm going to write render. And over here, I am just going to add either 0 or 1 randomly. So for that, what can I do? I can use the normal JavaScript functions to achieve the same. So for that, math.trunc, and within which I am going to write math.random. It will be in caps, math.random into 2. So I think that we are done. Now let's save it. Let's get back to app. It's all right. Now let's get back to the browser. Now you can see that IAM app is over here, then IAM sub app is over here, and then there is a counter, that is the child counter. Now if I click on sub app, it gets increased by 1, and you can see render over here. Again, if I click on it, though the value is not increasing, because for now 1 has not been added by the JavaScript math function that I have implemented over here. Inside the sub app, I have implemented this JavaScript math function that is randomly assigning 1 or 0. So over here, it has assigned 0, thus the value didn't update, but the render was locked. That is, rendering is happening, though the value is not updating. Again, if I click, 1 is added and rendering is done. So the rendering is done. Along with that, the value also gets updated. Now again, if I click, 0 is added, that is, the value is not updating, but the rendering is happening. So I would like to reduce this rendering. So I can do that just by keeping track of the fact that if the value that I am using as a counter over here, if that particular value increases, then only I will allow the rendering to happen. Otherwise, I will not allow. So let's get back over here and let's implement the logic. So for that, I will use should component update, and I will take 2 values as parameters over here, that is the props and state. Okay. Now now this child counter is nothing but a state variable to this sub app component. So if state dot child counter is equals to, which is a strict equality, this dot state dot child counter, that is, the current value and the previous value is same. So this is the previous value and this is the current value. If both are same, then I don't want the rendering to happen, because the value that is being displayed is same as the previous one. In that case, I'm going to return false. Otherwise, I'm going to return true. Now let's see what is happening. If I get back and I refresh, so rendering happens for the first time. That has to, because this particular function is called or invoked before re-rendering, not before rendering. So rendering for the first time will happen, and then in any consecutive rendering that happens after the first one, this particular function, that is should component update, is invoked. So now let's get back over here, and if I click, since 0 got added and the number remained same, so rendering has been prevented. Again, if I click, again 0 is added, so the number doesn't get updated and rendering is prevented. Now if I click again, so now as you see that after 3 clicks on the 4th one, as 1 got added randomly, so the value changed, and due to this change, this render has been logged, because rendering has been permitted then. by the function should component update. Now, whenever an increment happens, a render is being logged. So the number of times uh, or the value that is being displayed over here is equal to the number of times render is being logged on the console. So next again, let's click. So it's 2, so the render is 2. Again, if I click, it's 3, so the render is 3. Again, if I click, see over here the value remained 3 and the render also remained 3. Now if I again click, it is 4 and over here render is 4. So you have got an idea about how we can control the number of rendering or the number of times render is being invoked just by using the should component update. So let's get back over here. Now let's reverse it. If it's not equals, then it should be false. Otherwise, it should be true. So over here, whenever there is a 0, rendering will happen. Otherwise, it will not happen. So in this case, it was the number of times 1 was being added, render method was called. Now we are going to see the number of times 0 is being added, the render method gets called. So let's refresh it. Now if I click, 1 gets added. Then again if I click, okay, so let's get back over here. If state.childCounter not equals this dot child, so let's save it again. You can see that 0 got added, so render was logged. So previously we were seeing for +1, whenever 1 was added, render was logged. Now we are seeing for 0. Whenever 0 is being added, render is being logged. So again 0, so render. Again 1, render is being logged. Again over here, 1, render is being logged. So number of times 0 is being added, render is being logged. Since we have clicked too many times and only 1 is visible over here, so but we can see that in a render it's 4, but the value over here is 1. So when 1 was being added, the number of when 1 was considered, so we were returning whenever we were adding 1, isn't it? So let's get back over here. So you can see what we have implemented previously is, if like the previous value and the current value was same, then we returned false. It means that whenever we were adding a 0, it was false. But whenever we are adding a 1, it was true. Now in this case, over here, whenever we are adding a 0, if they are not equal, so whenever we are adding a 0, they are equal, so this is false. So it will come over here and it will be true. So let's get back over here now. Since you can see 1 is being displayed, but over here render is being logged 4 times. This is due to the fact that whenever a 0 is being added, we are returning true. But whenever a 1 is being added, we are returning false. So whenever 0 is being added, we are rendering, and whenever 1 is being added, we are not rendering. So we have got an idea about how we can optionally render the content that has been returned inside the render function just by writing some conditions within should component update. So this we were doing for the state variables, that is state.childCounter not equals this dot state.childCounter. So we were doing for the state variables, that is the variables associated to sub app itself. Now let's understand how we can implement the same for the props, isn't it? So for that, let's remove this particular thing from here. Okay. And over here, I am going to write this dot. So let's remove it from here for now. And let's save it. Let's keep it over here. Let's get back to app.js. Over here, I am going to implement this button. And finally, instead of writing child counter over here, I will be writing counter. I will be explaining each of the lines that I am writing over here to you soon. So over here, I am also going to use counter. Now what is counter? Counter I haven't defined yet, isn't it? So let's define counter first. So over here, I am going to use a constructor. Within that, I am going to use super to access this. And finally, I am going to define a state variable that is counter, which I am using in the button. Okay, so we are done with the counter, and on click of the button, I am either adding 0 or 1, that is added randomly. And also, what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to display the counter on the browser. So I can do that using this .state.counter. Also, I'm going to pass this value. This .state.count. So now I save it. So I am passing this counter variable as a prop to the sub-app component. And also I have implemented the button to update my counter variable randomly, either by adding 0 or by adding 1. So we are done with the app component. Now let's get back to this one. Over here, now I am going to write the logic for. So I do not need child counter anymore, isn't it? So let's remove this. And over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write props dot counter, or what variable I have used over here. Let's see. So over here I have used data. So I will access data. The data, if it is equals to this dot props dot data, then I will return false, otherwise I will return true. And I have logged render over here, isn't it? I have logged render inside the render function or render method of sub app, and inside app I am doing nothing, because we are not going to control the rendering of app. Rather, we are going to control the rendering of sub app from app using the state variable that has been defined in app. So now let's save it. Okay, let's get back over here. Okay, so first time rendering is being logged, and after that, let's see. So over here, I am app, and the counter is assigned over here or displayed over here. Now, let's make it more meaningful. Let's get back to app and just use app over here rather than using sub app, because this is a button that I've implemented in app. So if I click on app, nothing is incrementing. Okay. If I click on app again, nothing is incrementing. Again, then 1 is incrementing. And I have seen that render is being logged. If I click on it again, nothing is incrementing. Again, if I click nothing, 1 got added. And as soon as 1 got added, the value changed. The previous value was 1 and the current one is 2. And thus, render is being logged. So let's understand what is happening over here. So we have implemented a button in app component. Okay. So whenever we are clicking on that button, either 0 or 1 is being added to the counter variable, state variable that is associated to app. So if 0 is being added, then the value of counter is not changing. If 1 is being added, then the value is changing. So I am just displaying the value over here. And inside this custom component, that is sub app, I have passed that value as a prop. So every time either 0 is being added or 1, I am passing the updated value as a prop. So if I get back to the sub app now, which is the most important part over here. So in props, I have the previous value of prop, and the current value can be accessed using this.props.data. Okay. So in this.props.data, I have the updated value. So whenever I'm adding 1, this value is 1 less than this particular value. So these two values are not equal then. So return true is being executed. Otherwise, if these two values would have been true, then return false would have been executed. So as return true is being considered for an increment because the value are changing. Previous value is 1 less than the current. So this render method will be invoked. If the two values are same, that is the previous and the current, that means 0 is being added. So false is returned and this is not invoked. So whenever this render method is invoked, it means that 1 has been successfully added to the counter, which has been passed as a prop to sub app. Thus, let's get back over here. So whenever I click on app, if 1 is being added over here, that is the current value is 3, but the previous value should component update is 2. So render should happen. So it got increased by 1. Again, if I click 0 is being added. So the previous and the current value are same. So render is also not locked. Again, if I click, same thing happens. Again, I click, 1 get added and render is also being done. So you have got an idea about how should component update can be used to deal with the state variables associated with a particular component in which should component update has been implemented. Along with that, in a parent component, if we are dealing with a state variable and that changes, and we want to just render the child component based on the changes that are happening to the state variable associated to the parent component, we can just pass that particular variable as a prop, and then we can check different conditions and we can return Boolean values accordingly. So if true is being returned, then the component, then the render method in the component should get considered. If false is being returned, then the render method is not going to be invoked. So you've got an idea about how this particular method works, isn't it? So in the slides, we have discussed given a brief idea about all the 5 methods that are involved in a component's lifecycle. Along with that, in today's video, we have discussed the 6th one, and each of them are very much important, and I would recommend you all to have an idea about each one of them. So in upcoming videos, we will be discussing about functional components and hooks. We will be covering each of them in great details and depth. We will also discuss about React portals, fragments, and all such important topics. And finally, we will be implementing those together in a project. So there is a lot to come. It will take time, but surely it will improve your React game. So thank you for watching the video. Thank you for being with us. Till then, stay tuned.